Hello, everyone, again, and welcome to the second session of NCFS Unbound Season 3. We're delighted to see you all and delighted to have Lisa Algazi Marcus with us today, who is going to talk about her new book with Mary Jane Cowles. Lisa Algazi Marcus is professor of French and women's and gender studies at Hood College in Maryland, where she has taught since 1994. Lisa began attending NCFS in 1990, while she was still in grad school at Stanford. She has published articles in 19th-century French studies, L'Année Balzacienne, Romance Studies, and the Journal of Motherhood Initiative. Her first book, published in 2001, was on motherhood in the Stendhalian novel. Her latest book, and the book she's going to discuss with us today, is titled Mother's Milk and Male Fantasy in 19th Century Literature, and was published in June 2022 by Liverpool University Press. And I'm personally so excited to hear about it because I've been hearing papers based on this project for several years, and I'm just delighted to see this book in print. Her current project is translation of Zola's Fécondité, and I'm very much looking forward to that as well. She is going to be in conversation with Mary Jane Cowles, who is professor emerita at Kenyon College. She received her PhD from Princeton University and has published on the works of Rousseau, Madame de Staël, Madame de Duras, Nodier, Dumas, Balzac, and Nerval. Her interests include absent mothers in 19th century French literature and psychoanalytic theory. Her most recent publications appeared in NCFS, Paternal Law and the Abject in Ourika, and in the Revue de Nerval. So I'm going to now turn it over to Lisa.
Great. Okay, so let me see if I can get my PowerPoint to work, and we will get started. Okay, so as Masha said, I've been working on this book for a really long time. I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. So my title is Mother's Milk and Male Fantasy in 19th Century French Narrative. I was really pleased with the cover, so I wanted to talk about that a little bit. So this painting is by Edouard de Bas-Ponsant, Avant le bal, before the ball, and it's dated around 1886, they think, more or less, and it's in the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Tours. One of my close friends who's on this call, Amy Gottfried, pointed out the lovely reflection of the white globe in the mirror after I'd chosen this image, and I just thought it was fabulous. So there are breast references everywhere in this painting, and I think it's a lot of fun. So how did it begin? So I was thinking about what to say today. I'm trying to keep this sort of informal. I'm just going to be talking to you. I'm not reading a formal paper or anything, about how the project started, and then a little bit about what is in the book. So how this all began was I was in California at Stanford, and if you're not familiar with this study of Balzac's head by Rodin, it's in the Stanford Museum. So I was doing my PhD in Stendhal studies and working on Stendhal and reading, of course, across the 19th century. And I came across Mémoires de deux jeunes mariés by Balzac, which has wonderful passages in it talking about erotic breastfeeding in very great detail. And I was so fascinated by this that I put it aside. It did not have anything to do really with my dissertation, but I put it aside, put it in a drawer, metaphorically, and decided I would come back to it later. So then I started giving conference papers on this topic, first in Kentucky, and Jane will remember the Kentucky Foreign Language Conference, which is where we met, I believe. My first time there was in the mid-90s, early to mid-90s. And then I started doing papers on this at NCFS. As Masha mentioned, she very kindly said, a few years. It's been since 1997, I think. So Athens was my first paper on breastfeeding at NCFS, which is a long time ago. And my most recent one was in 2018 in Los Angeles. So I've been developing this project through papers at 19th Century French Studies for going on 20 years, if not more. And I teach at a small liberal arts college. I teach 4 and 3, so I don't have a lot of time to get projects done. So it has taken me a really long time to bring this to fruition. I'm really excited to see it in print. And then I asked around at 19th Century French Studies a few years ago, what publisher should I consider? Several people recommended Liverpool, so I went with Liverpool, and I've been very happy with working with them. They've been really great with the book. So I have so many foremothers and forefathers, as we all do when we embark on a research project. And I just wanted to give you a few of them. So Elizabeth Badinter started me out on motherhood and motherhood studies. Alan Pascoe's book, Sick Heroes, was really important in my work. Selling Mother's Milk, the wet nursing business in France, for the historical context, was invaluable. And similarly, Les nourrices à Paris au 19e siècle, same sort of thing for background. Of course, Marilyn Yalom's History of the Breast was very important. And this really amazing, very weird book called Tétoniana, Curiosité médicale, littéraire et artistique sur les seins et l'allaitement, which is just exactly what it sounds like. It's a collection of weird factoids about breasts, put together by a doctor in the 1890s. And this is how I found many of my sources, including the very strange novel about corrupt breast milk by Alexandre Epp that you'll hear about in a minute. So chapter 1 is a background chapter. It's talking about the 18th century, so how we got to the 19th century in terms of breastfeeding, and particularly in literature, but a little bit in the arts as well. So the image you see here is La Fontaine de la Régénération. So this is a fountain that was built for a revolutionary festival in 1793. And here you have an engraving of it. And the man gathering the milk, and apparently it was a milky substance that was spurting from the statue's breasts. The man gathering the milk there into a cup is Hérault de Seychelles, who was the president of the convention at the time. And the quote that I am most fond of his is que toutes les vertus guerrières et généreuses coulent avec le lait maternel dans le cœur de tous les nourrissons de la France. So this gives you some idea of the Republican imagery around breastfeeding during the Revolutionary period, which is great fun to look at. I had lots and lots of images to choose from on this. So the 18th century is a period of course, enlightenment, but it's also a period of the growth of the wet nursing industry in France in general, and a lot of infants are dying in France during this period. The infant mortality rates were just sky high. Estimates range between 50 to 80% of babies who were sent out to nurse, which was almost all babies, who died. So 50% we think of just infants who were sent out by their parents, and about 80 to 90% of foundlings died. This, of course, was not an acceptable statistic to most folks in France, particularly medical authorities. And so everybody was trying to pressure mothers to breastfeed more, to keep their children with them. And this was counter to the culture. It was not an acceptable behavior for women, particularly noble women, to keep their children with them. So this is all the historical context that is behind the literary representations that I wanted to take a look at in the rest of the book. This is kind of a background chapter, but there's a lot of really interesting details in there. I also talked about the breastfeeding manuals that were very popular in the 18th century, one in particular by Angélique de Rebourg, which I'm really fond of. I wish I had a copy to show you, but I saw it at the National Library in Paris, and it's about this big. It's a tiny little thing. So it could fit in your hand, and you can read in it all the things that you need to know about how to breastfeed a child. So this was written by a midwife, and it's a wonderful example of transmitting knowledge from women to women and during this period. And those manuals were taken over slowly throughout the 19th century by the male medical establishment until we got to a point where women weren't listened to anymore at all. Midwives voices were pretty much silenced, but not in the 18th century. So that's kind of cool. Okay, so chapter 2, yeah, you see this is sort of a very quick overview. Chapter 2 is called The Absence of the Breast and the Tale of the Romantic Hero. And here you have a couple of images that I mentioned in the chapter. I did decide at one point to not include these images in the book because it was just so much work, and I didn't have time to go and get all the permissions that I needed for the images. So it's fun to be able to share them with you rather than have them in the book, unfortunately. So the thesis of this chapter is pretty much that, as the title says, that the mother, the breastfeeding mother specifically, is mostly absent from romantic literature. And I found this interesting because there were so many examples in the late 18th century of this, and then suddenly there aren't. And the same goes for the visual arts. What I'm showing you here by Constance Mayer is one of the exceptional pairs of paintings, but there aren't that many. It just drops off. And so my thesis, my theory here is that the romantic hero is all about him, right? That the tale of the romantic hero is about me, 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 me. As we teach our students when we teach romanticism, it's all about me. And my mother is just an accessory to me. So a lot of these writers also were not nursed by their mothers. So that's another element to this. And that's where Alan Pascoe's work comes in, talking about the longing of these authors to be nursed by someone or to participate in this mother-child relationship that they missed out on. But that's not universally the case. Lamartine was nursed by his mother. Hugo was nursed by his mother. And yet the images of breastfeeding are few and far between during this period. And I also think that Napoleon had a role to play in that, and his attitudes about women, which I could go into in more detail if you're interested. Okay. Oh, and then the big exception to this rule is, of course, Georges Sand, and the Sandiens in the room will be pleased to hear that she is very different from all of the other authors that I found. Her mentions of breastfeeding and breastfeeding mothers are very matter of fact, very down to earth, very, so this is what you do. They're not romanticized in any way like you see in these paintings. They're not, it's not a part of a fantasy, of anybody's fantasy. It's just something that you do, like making dinner. It's what you do. So in opposition to that, the paintings that you see here, on the left, we have La Mère Heureuse, the happy mother, and she has just breastfed her child, and the child is resting. And of course, they're in the forest, in nature, as they should be in a romantic setting. And then on the right, you have La Mère Infortunée, and you can barely see the tomb of her dead child down in the right corner. And she is very, very unhappy because I believe some of the legends that went with this these paintings explained that the mother on the right did not breastfeed her child, and therefore it died. So this is part of the propaganda that continued from the 18th through the 19th century, trying to get women to breastfeed more to bring down infant mortality rates. Okay, so then chapter 3. We have realism, naturalism, and the eroticization of breastfeeding. And for this, I chose Renoir's Woman Nursing a Child for the image to show you. And this, I think, is a sort of male gaze on the breastfeeding mother. And that's very much what you see in this period in literature as well. The male presence, the male gaze becomes really important and almost more important than the mother-child dyad in a lot of cases. And of course, this is where Balzac's Mémoire de jeune mariée fits in. So I talk about that book here. I talk about fécondité and the male gaze, Mathieu, the protagonist, and Marianne, his wife, and how they form a group with their children as Marianne breastfeeds. And then I talk about the corruption of breast milk in also Fécondité and in a novel by Alexandre Epp that many of you have heard me talk about called Another's Milk. from 1891. And this is a story, a sordid tale of a wet nurse who sexually abuses the young boy that she is charged with caring for. She starts out being an attentive wet nurse and then slowly starts corrupting and abusing the young boy until, of course, he is completely lost. His morals are lost, and he's a mess, and she dies, of course. And so this is a really interesting example of how breastfeeding how wet nursing specifically corrupts a family. And I could say a lot more about that, but perhaps we'll get to it later. And then, and this is the chapter where Avant le bal also fits in nicely, right? So you have the father watching in the background, watching his wife while she breastfeeds, and seeming rather interested in what he sees. And then you have finally chapter 4, breastfeeding literature and politics in the Third Republic. And I have reviewer 2 to thank for this chapter, because I hadn't planned to put an entire chapter on Marianne and political imagery in the book. And reviewer 2, who I don't know the identity of, but who may be in the Zoom room today, thank you very much, because this was a great suggestion and it really helped me figure out the focus of the book. So this chapter is all about Marianne, who's the emblem of the French Republic. And the image you see, I think most of us are familiar with. This is Daumier, La République. The image you see, however, is only a sketch. And I didn't really know that when I started into this research, but Daumier was invited to make a final version of this for the contest. He had entered this into a contest to become the emblem of the new republic in 1848, and he declined to make a final copy. He didn't participate in the final round of the contest. And so this absolutely forgettable painting by Jérôme is what we had instead. And Jérôme won the contest with this painting, which is now in the attic somewhere in the Petit Palais. Nobody cares about it at all. But Daumier's La République is still a really active part of the public imagination. And I talk about why that is, or why that might be. And then I talk about Marianne, the name Marianne, and why I think Zola's heroine in Fécondité is named Marianne, and what that has to do with Zola's political ideology. And in the novel that I talked about by Alexandre Epp, the horrible breastfeeding, the horrible wet nurse novel, that wet nurse is also named Marianne. And my theory is that Epp was criticizing the Republic in the 1890s when he wrote the novel by calling this very corrupt figure by that name. There we go. So the conclusion of the book is that most of the representations that I found in literature across the 19th century, and many of those, by the way, were sent to me by many of you, and I appreciate that very much. Thank you. For years and years of people saying, oh, there's a breastfeeding image, I'll send it to Lisa. Thank you very much for doing that. So my conclusion of all of this was that most of the representations that I found had very little to do with reality, with the actual lives of breastfeeding women, and much more to do with the fantasies of the people who were writing. Of mostly men who were writing these representations into literature. Mostly men, but not all. Marceline Desbordes-Valmore is an example of a female author who had the same sort of unrealistic portrayals of breastfeeding. She didn't breastfeed her children. She sent them out to a wet nurse. It took me a long time to find that information, but it was really interesting to me because I had guessed it from reading her poetry. But she did not breastfeed herself. So George Sand is really, again, the only exception that I could find to the rule. And I decided to give George Sand the last word in the book. And the last word is her quote, and I'll read it. Rousseau created nourrices, nursing mothers, when he believed he was creating mothers. He mistook the maternal breast for the creating soul, and that is l'âme génératrice. So I think Sand had the right idea that most of the men writing Rousseau onwards really created their own ideology, their own fantasy of the breastfeeding mother that had nothing to do with the actual day-to-day experience of breastfeeding mothers in France. So that's pretty much what I have to say at this point.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Lisa. And I'm going to now spotlight Jane and turn it over to the two of you.
Cool.
Well, hello to everyone. And thank you so much to the organizers, Masha and Susan, for providing this opportunity for Lisa to talk about her book and for me to participate in that as well. Lisa, I really enjoyed so much reading your book. It is incredibly clear. It is readable. It's a very important subject. And I think that in the book, you go further than you attended many of your presentations, if not all. Almost
probably all.
I think that you go much further in the book than you do in your presentations. And in fact, I think you could almost call it Mother's Milk and Male Fantasy and the Nation, especially because of the last chapter. But we'll probably get back to that a little bit later. One of my first questions, I think, is I was wondering how you uncovered some of the less obvious sources that you cite, and which were most valuable to you, aside from the ones that you've already mentioned as being the 4 fathers and 4 mothers.
Right. Well, yeah, one of the first things that comes to mind, but it was on my slide, is that Tetoniana book by George Witowski, because it was just such a strange find in the Bibliothèque Nationale that, you know, I didn't know that such a thing existed, and I happened to come across it, and it just had such a wealth. This was just a doctor who collected strange and curious tales about breasts, and that's the book. That's the whole book. There's no thesis, there's no any, it's just a list. So that was really fun to go through and try to find those things. And I found a lot of really obscure references from that. I also discovered about, I guess, 8 or 9 years ago, something like that, a new museum that had just opened, an eco museum in Burgundy, called the Museum of the Wet Nurse and of Public Assistance. And I was so excited when I heard that this museum had opened, because obviously it's, you know, it's my passion. I was very excited to go visit. And I had a sabbatical in 2017 when I was able to go and visit the museum. And the 2 founders of the museum, the former mayor of the little village, Aligny-en-Morvan, and another person, a woman who lived in the village, were very excited to greet this American coming from you know, to Burgundy to see their tiny little pet project. And their claim to fame is that Jean Genet was raised in that village by wet nurses. He was a foundling and he was raised there, and there's a plaque saying Jean Genet lived here. So that was really fun, but they showed me the archives of the museum and told me stories about the local doctors. And I had read much of their work already in the National Library, but one of them was named Dr. Monod. And what I didn't know when I went to the museum is that he had a rival, a political rival in that area named Dr. Despiot. And Despiot was a Republican and Monod was a Bonapartist. And so they did not get along, and they were both doctors, and they had very different philosophies on wet nursing. Monod thought it was a terrible scourge and that it had destroyed the area. And he was against it. He thought it was very bad. And wet nurses, he wrote treatises about how wet nurses' infants died very often. Whereas Despiot thought it had been really good for the economy of the villages and how much more prosperous everybody was. So Despiot wrote a pamphlet about 16 pages long that the museum had an original copy of and let me read. And it was fascinating to hear this story. And that had been left to their archives by one of the descendants of one of these doctors. I think it was Monod. So that was really fun to discover all of that. And I've just messaged the museum this week to tell them that their copy is going to be on the way. I want to send them a copy of the book.
Very nice, nice. Another one of the many themes in your book has to do, of course, with psychoanalytic theory. And in that regard, I'd like to ask a question about breast envy. You speak about Balzac's presentation of, in the Lettres des deux jeunes mariés, about his ability to, or his desire to project himself a little bit into the identity. These are letters written in the first person. So when he's describing this erotic experience, he is doing so in the first person and projecting himself into the imagination of the woman. And there are a few other examples of this. I think myself of a brief mention in 93, where one of the characters imagines the suffering that this mother is feeling after having her children taken away from her. So I wanted to know a little bit, what is this a more positive element of the question of the male gaze, or is it another kind of manipulation?
Oh, I think it's both, probably. Depends on the example, on the text that you're looking at. So we start with Mémoires de deux jeunes mariés, which is where my project started. And in that one, I've read a lot of critics who have theorized and wondered about how Balzac managed to put himself into the woman's body in this way. And several of the critics have used words like transsexual imagination. Balzac really makes himself into a woman to feel what women feel when they're breastfeeding, etc. And what I wondered immediately was, who told him? Where did he get this information? So how did he do his research? Because it is very convincing. I agree with the critics that it's quite convincing that he manages to really put himself inside the head of a breastfeeding woman in an interesting way. So I did a lot of archival research trying to figure out where he got this information. Was it from Zelma Cowles, who talked to him a lot about her experiences with motherhood? Well, no, she wasn't able to nurse. So that was, I struck out. Was it his sister? And no, I don't think it really was. So yeah, it was an interesting question, but I think a lot of it is just him, as you said, looking, it's observing and imagining what that experience must be like, I think, and having such a longing to be in that mother-child dyad as the child, which he never got to do because he wasn't nursed by his mother. So that kind of, I think, makes him in some ways obsessed with the idea of breastfeeding in an interesting way. And then there are a lot of other examples. Victor Hugo, for example, there are a couple of poems that I pulled out that I talk about in my book, where it's all about the mother's suffering because the child dies. Let's see, there's one called the Fantôme, the phantom, the ghost, where a child dies and the mother is devastated. And of course, the mother, it's all about the breastfeeding mother. So the mother has been breastfeeding this child and then it dies. And she has a second baby, and the baby is at the breast and whispers to the mother, "It's me, don't tell anyone." So yes, the idea that, the child has come back. So perhaps she doesn't need to be as devastated. But it was interesting to me that in Hugo and also Chateaubriand, the nursing mother, the image of the nursing mother is very often, if not always, linked to death and suffering in some way.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's envy as much as, the opposite. It's like, it's a bad thing.
Yeah, it kind of raises the question, I think, of there being an overlap between identity and imagination for the writer. And you can raise the same question vis-a-vis women writers, but it's, yeah. Another take on breast envy is envying the nursling, right? And I couldn't help but think of, especially in the context of the male gaze, I couldn't help but think of this point in the Lacan's Seminar 11, which has a huge section on the gaze, of his discussion of the thoughts of St. Augustine and his confessions, writing about the envy of a child, an older brother viewing a younger brother nursing, and he stresses the invidia, envy, the presence of videre, of seeing. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the relation between this idea of envy in terms of the male gaze, or envy in terms of another, and the nursling mother dyad.
Yeah, I think that you could definitely.
The question of breastfeeding is so much connected with the body. It kind of makes the question a little bit.
Absolutely, yeah. I think perhaps fécondité is the best place to go for that, because you have Mathieu, the hero, the main character, unless you want to argue that Marianne is the main character, who is constantly staring at his wife's breasts and his wife breastfeeding, and seems to want to be a part of the mother-child dyad in a very visceral way. He talks about the mother and child, whichever child it is. She has so many, I can't keep them all straight. But the random baby that happens to be at her breast at any given moment, he talks about that in terms of his wish to be part of it, his wish to be, closer to them, his adoration of the mother-child dyad is all through the book. I think that's one place where that's one thing it makes me think of is the strength of the mother-child dyad being something that men, or the men in the novels, and we think probably the authors, are envious of and want to be a part of. And that goes back to Alan Pascoe's arguments in Sick Heroes, when he talks about the desires of these romantic heroes to reunite with the mothers that they never had, because they were sent out to wet nurses, as most children were at that time. And they would be sent out until they were 3 or 4 years old, typically. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but
I also think that there is a question, and you do bring this up, of who owns the milk, who has a right to milk. And I was wondering if, again, following up a little bit on that question, if you could elaborate a little bit what you say in your book about the question of ownership.
Yeah, that's a really tough one, actually. And it continues to be a legal issue in France even today. I read some 21st century legal scholars who were talking about this. So who owns the milk? Is it, and it's actually in some ways similar to the discussions that we have about other ways of owning one's body or not owning one's body in terms of abortion, for example. So who has the right to the milk? Who has the right to terminate the pregnancy? All those sorts of things are sort of wrapped in together in a lot of legal scholarship. But to get back to your question of ownership, so who can force, or can one force the mother to breastfeed? Does that milk belong to the child? So a lot of governmental authorities in the 19th century wrote that yes, the milk belongs to the child, that it doesn't belong to the mother, it belongs to the child, and the child must have access to it. But there was no way to enforce this, particularly on wealthier mothers. They could enforce it on poor mothers, and they did. The Roussel law in 1874 mandated that, among other things, that women who were going to be wet nurses had to follow a whole list of regulations in order to sell their milk, etc. and also that the mothers who were receiving public assistance from the state, and this goes back to the revolution, those mothers would be forced to breastfeed their children in order to receive that assistance. So they could give them incentives, they couldn't legally force them.
Do you think this goes as far as to suggest that the nation in some way owns the milk?
That I think that has been suggested by multiple authors and authorities in the 19th century, that particularly it's wrapped up in that iconography around the Republic that I was talking about. Mm-hmm. That and the damier image gives us a good sort of illustration of that. That Michelet talks about that in Le Peuple as well. The idea of the nation, of the Republic nursing its millions of citizens. That's, the milk is supposed to belong to the citizens, to the country, and to the patrie. Yeah.
If we think of the wet nursing economy as a kind of equation, there is a remainder, and the remainder is the wet nurse's child, who does not benefit often and with alarming regularity dies. So I was wondering if in terms of, what belongs to the private sphere and what belongs to the public sphere, and this remainder of the wet nurse's child themselves, if you would like to elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, so the Dr. Monod that I talked about, his big breakthrough was he won an award from the Medical Academy in Paris for a treatise about wet nurses' children and what happened to them in his little hamlet in the area of Aligny-en-Morvan. So what he talked about was that the entire economy based on wet nursing in that region was based on the deaths of these children, right? The deaths of the children were a necessary result of this thriving wet nursing economy, where women would sell their milk and send back money. If they went to Paris to sell their milk, they would send back money to their families, or if they stayed in the village and nursed, they would have the money and it would get spent in the village and it would make the village more prosperous. This is what the other Dr. Despiot that I mentioned earlier was talking about when he said that it was making the economy more prosperous in the area and in all the areas that were known for breastfeeding, but Morvan was one of the biggest ones, one of the ones with the best reputation. It made a huge difference in the local economy. And the level of prosperity, particularly in times of drought or times of recessions or in economic difficulties, more and more peasant women and poor women would be selling their milk to compensate for the other issues that they were having economically. So it was a big deal for the French economy at the time.
Mm-hmm. But also, I think, and you suggest this too, it is a loss, I think, especially in times of infant mortality affecting the population.
Absolutely.
Population growth was much needed.
Absolutely. And there were a lot of more and more authorities, especially around and right after the Franco-Prussian War, exclaiming about the need for, populating the nation and making more new soldiers, because the Prussians will get us if we don't have enough soldiers. So yeah, there were all kinds of reasons why infant mortality was a big problem and was perceived to be a big problem in this period.
Again, I think it's so interesting that what seems most intimate, this mother-child dyad, then becomes, is implicated in the structure of the nation. Mm-hmm. That's really
it becomes a bien public, much in the same way that a pregnant belly does when you go into public and people touch it. So, yes.
Well, I think it's probably a good idea to open up, allow the other attendees to ask some questions. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if Masha wants to take over at this point.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this fabulous conversation. I'm going to
I see one question in the chat for the moment.
Do you want me to read it? I'll read it. Lisa, congratulations on the book. It's from Annie Smart. Could you give us an idea? Sorry. Could you give us an idea of when and how the wet nursing business ended? What discourses prevailed in ending the business?
Right. Hi, Annie. So yeah, in spite of all of the propaganda that was put out in visual arts, in texts, in every form that you can imagine, popular press, everything for like 150 years, I guess. The wet nursing industry remained very strong throughout the 19th century. It transformed a little bit in that it was more common to have a wet nurse live with you in your home toward the end of the 19th century than it was at the beginning of the century, rather than sending your children out to a wet nurse in the country. But it was still very much the norm to have a wet nurse right up until World War I. Right after World War I was when the wet nursing business slowly started failing. And it wasn't because of the propaganda. It wasn't because women suddenly decided to nurse their children as men had been telling them they should for 200 years. None of that worked. What worked was pasteurization. And pasteurization, of course, made milk safe, cow's milk safe to give to infants. Before that, when we gave cow's milk to infants, they very often died because they were full of bacteria and they would get ill. Or the baby bottles that were used were not sterilized properly, and so the children would get ill and die. So it was a very dangerous proposition before pasteurization and sterilization became not only were invented, but became affordable and more accessible to more people. And that really didn't happen until after World War I.
So I wanted to say also, at this point, if you'd like to turn on your cameras, but still keep your microphones off, please do so. And we also have a question from Aimé Boutin. Is it mostly writers from the middle or upper classes, or did you come across writers from the lower classes that discuss breastfeeding in their works? Debord Valmore was working as an actress when she had her children, except Inès.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that, Aimé. Thank you for that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I got enough information on some of the authors that I looked at. I'm trying to think now. I think most of them were probably middle class, were probably bourgeois. I don't remember very many lower class that I was aware of, but I'm going to definitely look into that and see if I can find out. Since I'm thinking of you, Aimé, I'm thinking of Courbet, but he was more upper class, right? I think. You know better than I do.
So actually, I have a question. So I think I might have mentioned it at some point, but in my research on 19th century public transportation,
right,
I came across, it seemed to be really a lieu commun of the nourrice nursing her charges inside an omnibus. Yeah. And, usually some sort of catastrophe would follow, the child will scream. It was always a source of chaos and disorder. And, I was always curious about, first of all, were there any laws governing breastfeeding in public? There are so many conversations about it today. Right. I cannot believe we're still having, but here we are, right? In general, because so much of what I write about is about fantasy, just like your book, right? So I was curious, to your knowledge, were there any, were there people breastfeeding were there wet nurses breastfeeding their charges in public, or was that a complete fantasy?
Well, all I have to go by, of course, is like you, is texts. So, so I can't be sure. We certainly have accounts of wet nurses breastfeeding their charges in public parks, for example. It seemed to be fairly common, unless, of course, the authors were inventing it, but I don't think so entirely. There were multiple mentions of that in Mercier's Tableau de Paris, for example, where there are random women nursing in parks, and most of them are wet nurses being paid for this, and you know that by the way they're dressed and their bonnets. There's Daumier's painting of the third-class carriage where there's a woman breastfeeding there in the train. So I think it was fairly common. That's my impression. And I don't really think that breastfeeding in public was a big deal. Not sure it is today in France. I mean, we're much more pudique in this country, much more worried about public nudity than the French, I think, even now. But yeah, I think it would probably have been fairly common. The main thing that you see about that in texts is how smelly the wet nurses were, that they smelled of sour milk and they were just nasty. So
yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And on the omnibus, especially so. So thank you. We have a question from Catherine Moore. She says, while reading chapters 1 and 2, I was struck by the movement from the Republican mother propaganda to the lack of nursing representation, and the representation that was there, particularly in Le Gouvet, Chateaubriand, Hugo, focused on the link between maternal nursing and maternal grief. I kept thinking about the trauma that these writers must have experienced during the revolution that Lamartine notes in his work. Do you see these representations as processing the trauma of the promise of the Republican mother, resulting in virtuous citizens and the potential failure of the revolutionary project in producing a virtuous society?
Wow, that's a great question, Catherine. Thank you. Yeah, I think it was definitely about processing trauma, first of all. And that's what Pascoe says in Sick Heroes as well, that the trauma of this entire generation of children born during and around the revolution was transmitted through their works, and they used their writings to deal with it, to process it, as you said. So the promise of the Republican mother. Yeah, that's interesting. So the idea of one of the ideas behind the revolution, and Mary Jacobus talks about this in more detail in her book First Things, which was another one of the major sources for my book. One of the big promises of the revolution was that every citizen was going to be taken care of. So not only would the citizens be virtuous, as you point out, but they would also be cared for. They would be taken care of by the government, by the republic, and everybody would live in prosperity and peace. And of course, it didn't work out that way. And so I'm sure that was a disappointment to French people at the time in general. And we can certainly see that in the author's works, in the various authors' works that I talk about in the book. There is a lot of trauma and grief and sadness in the portrayals of breastfeeding in the first maybe 20, 30 years of the century. That is puzzling until you look at the historical context. And I think that really helps to understand it better.
So we have another question on infant formula from Lauren Pinska. What was the role of the infant formula in the history of breastfeeding? You mentioned pasteurization.
Yep.
Babies can't usually drink cow's milk.
Right. So we say nowadays that babies can't drink cow's milk, but that was all there was. So they did drink cow's milk. In fact, they drank unpasteurized raw cow's milk. And they died in great numbers because it is dangerous for babies to drink that. To my knowledge, infant formula wasn't invented until much later. I don't know when in the 20th century that became a thing. But pasteurized milk was certainly safer. Pasteurized cow's milk was certainly safer for infants to drink than raw, unpasteurized cow's milk. So while it isn't ideal, and today we would say it's a terrible idea, it was still safer than the alternative that they had previously, if that helps.
Great. Well, then I'd invite everyone to turn on their cameras, and if there are more questions, maybe you could just unmute yourself and ask it live. And in any case, I would like to congratulate Lisa again on a wonderful accomplishment, and to thank Mary Jane for a really fabulous conversation. And it's been really a joy. So thank you.
And thank you, Masha, for having me. This is such a great series. I really appreciate it.
Well, I also wanted to thank Susan and Rachel, my co-organizers, without whom, of course, the series would not be happening. So